Welcome to Mind Polish. Today we're going to discuss homosexuality in the Islamic world from historical and religious perspectives. While today, the Muslim world and homosexuality may seem incompatible, historically, there were instances of homosexuality expressed through stories and poetry, or at least, that's what a modern reader would understand. Though it was never accepted as normal or permissible, it was circulating in some form of arts and literature such as poems. To Muslims who may identify as homosexual, or feel that desire, or one who wants to become a Muslim, but sees that it is not permitted to be a homosexual, it is not all gloomy. So, let's get started. Before we begin, let's clarify 2 points. First, the term Muslim, Islamic or Islamicate world are often used interchangeably to mean numerous things, and is challenged because it implies that Islam is responsible for whatever topic is being discussed. Like the media always portray terrorists being Muslim, when terrorism is condemned heavily in Islam and is punishable with death. Or here in this video, as we say Islamic or Muslim world, it doesn't mean the religion, it refers to its geographical context, the regions comprising nations or empires that identify as Muslim, so again, not Islam as a religion. This area spans from Spain to India and beyond, in its historical context, with diverse practices and social norms. Islam's stance on homosexuality is intertwined with its history, so we need to talk about it. Most, if not all, Islamic scholars maintain that homosexual acts are forbidden from a religious standpoint. In the modern era, some scholars are trying hard to find room for homosexuality, but historically and theologically, no Islamic scholars tried to reconcile the act of homosexuality with Islam, nor will they be able to. But, this is not over for those who have the tendency to shun the idea of Islam yet. The Quran explicitly condemns it through the story of Prophet Lot and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, according to all schools of thought, it is completely forbidden. However, there are varying opinions on the punishment and how it should be applied. This prohibition didn't stop people from engaging in homosexual acts or some people's affinity to the same sex, but it did deter it from being accepted as normal, as well as discouraged people from publicizing it. Before the modern era, there wasn't a concept of sexual identity as people are trying to make it in the modern era. People could engage in showing affinity to the opposite sex without it defining their identity as male or female like is the case today. Especially in the Islamic world, there may have been instances of affinity to the same gender in a way, but the identity of being homosexual was not a thing, and also, from a theological perspective, feelings are not punished. So, if someone feels attracted to the same gender, they are not punished, as long as they do not act upon their feelings. Also, when Islam says punishment, there are two, in this life and in the afterlife. Both of these do not apply for people who have feelings for the same sex, but for those who act upon their feelings and do not repent and cease. The punishment is for those who are engaging in actions of homosexuality and insisting on them both in this life and the hereafter. What is interesting to know is in this life, for that punishment to take place, there are very rigid rules, which are similar to adultery. There has to be 4 witnesses of the act happening, and these witnesses need to be practicing Muslims. This virtually means it can never happen. Because, for instance, practicing Muslims can never be spying on people's private residences. So, unless those acting upon their tendencies come out and want to be punished for what they have done, they won't ever be discovered and punished. What is even more staggering is that there isn't any records to show that these criteria have ever been met with adultery, but there are a few when it comes to homosexual acts. This means that there isn't a single case where 4 Muslim men have witnessed such adultery and reported it for the governing body to take its legal course. There are also no well-documented historical records of a case where 4 practicing Muslims witnessed an act of sodomy and testified to it in accordance with the strict evidentiary requirements of Islamic law. So punishment for major sins like adultery or homosexuality under Islamic law can occur in only 2 ways: through a confession, which accounts for the majority of recorded punishments to these actions, or through the testimony of 4 witnesses, of which there are almost no records. Convictions based on witness testimony are exceedingly rare, particularly in cases of homosexuality, due to the inherent difficulty in obtaining such testimony without violating the principles of privacy and modesty, which are core tenets in Islam. Moreover, in the rare cases involving homosexuality, the rulings and judgments are made by the governing authorities, not by laymen. So, a regular man can't pass such judgments out, which if you do witness, is not Islamic, since a layman has no authority to judge. The one incident of homosexuality, which many scholars doubt its authenticity, is that Khalid ibn al-Walid had encountered a man named al-Fajr al-Salami, and reported back to the caliphate, in which he along with his advisors, including Ali ibn Abu Talib, agreed that he should be executed. However, there aren't many details regarding the incident, nor any accounts about the witnesses that are necessary to exact any judgment. There isn't even any account that al-Fajr, for instance, confessed to his actions. Since we got this out of the way, let us get back to some historical references to such affinity existing in the Islamic world. Throughout Islamic history, there were identities that sometimes overlapped with sexuality. For instance, women who dressed like men could have sex with either men or women, and it had nothing to do with how they dressed. Interestingly, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, discussed homosexuality as a state of being, psychological, rather than just an act, though he considered it an incurable disease. However, modern psychologists see it as curable, like Dr. George Reckers and many others. But, the case is that no one deemed it normal throughout history, from every civilization, including Muslims. Yet, Muslims emerged as the most tolerant to effeminate men, as they are not punished for being effeminate, or what we may deem gay by today's standards. As long as these people have not acted upon their desires, have not been witnessed in the act, nor have they confessed to their acts, no one would know, and they would not be punished. This is under Sharia law. But, even if some may have had an affinity towards the same sex, or even acted upon it, they were still expected to be part of a family unit and have children, since in most cases, being private and modest, a main tenet, and since these actions have not been witnessed, no one knows. As long as people fulfilled these social expectations, no one knew. There are also very important points when it comes to Islam, in that narrations undergo tremendous scrutiny to be verifiable, and many of the stories circulating the internet have not been verifiable from an Islamic standard and a verifiable and trustworthy chain of narration. Like the many stories about Abbasid Caliph al-Amin, Harun al-Rashid's son and successor, who allegedly had a preference for eunuchs and began appearing with them in public. They allegedly say it was scandalous in Abbasid Iraq in the 9th century, because al-Amin seemed more interested in them than in running the empire. His mother, Zubaydah, was said to have countered this by dressing up beautiful girls in the clothing of eunuch servants. This account is not verifiable, nor authentic. There are also accounts circulating of Caliph al-Hakam II of Cordoba having a preference for men to the extent that he didn't touch women and couldn't produce an heir. His wife, Sub, allegedly had to cut her hair and dress like a man, even taking the nickname Jafar, which was also the name of al-Hakam's closest childhood friend. Al-Hakam wasn't able to produce his first heir until he was 46. But these accounts are also not verifiable in any historical records. There are numerous other unverifiable accounts of homosexual relationships between monarchs and their courtiers. Some say that al-Hakam father had both male and female harems, which has no authenticity. Al-Mu'tamid, the emir of the Taifa of Seville, was in love with a poet named Ibn Ammar is another unverifiable claim made by those people who are trying so hard to reconcile homosexuality with the history of Islam. They say that wherever there were slave soldiers, there was almost always a sexual relationship between the monarch and one or more of his trusted men, which is a false generalization. Fake examples circulating include Mahmud of Ghazna and Malik Ayas, Ala ad-Din Khalji and Malik Kafur, and the Mamluks of Egypt. They also claim it was even common among Ottoman soldiers, who often appointed someone to monitor new soldiers and their superiors. They try to reconcile homosexuality with the Islamic world so badly to try to appease the Western world's adoption of these policies. In those rare instances that these acts may have been recorded by confessions, homosexual relationships were usually not between equals in status. It was also mostly common with Sufism. Sufi poetry is full of seemingly homoerotic themes, mentioning love between men repeatedly. However, it's simplistic to interpret this poetry as purely sexual. It's not always clear whether the love is platonic or romantic, and even if it's romantic, whether it involves sex, the act of sodomy. In the instances that some have confessed their acts, they were always trying to repent for their actions, meaning they knew it was wrong and not permissible under Islamic values and laws. For example, modern interpretations suggest Rumi and Shams Tabrizi were lovers, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Rumi loved Shams Tabrizi deeply, but it's hard to determine the nature of that love. Rumi adhered to Sharia and spoke against sodomy, so we can assume their relationship wasn't sexual. In Islam, one's love for their brothers can be very deep, but it does not entail sexuality. This wasn't true for all Sufis. Sufis ranged widely in their adherence to Sharia. Some followed it meticulously, while others rejected it almost entirely. While none admitted to having sex with other men, due to fear of being persecuted under Muslims' laws, there are subtle inferences. This also relates to the concept of shahid batsi. To simplify, shahid batsi is the idea that you can love God by loving one of God's creations, often beautiful men and boys. The extent of this love was debated. Could you just appreciate their beauty, love them, or even have sex with them? Advocates of shahid batsi included Jami, Adar, and Hafiz, though none explicitly advocated for sex. This Persian concept may have been the seeping of Persian traditions into Islam. Some interpret the love for men in poetry as a metaphor for devotion to God. But why use men as a metaphor and not women? This is because much of Islamic philosophy was inspired by the ancient Greeks, who often depicted love between men in their poetry. The Greeks were also very interested in pederasty. This was so common that an ancient Greek reader would assume any mention of love in literature was between two men, unlike normal readers who assume it's between a man and a woman. Some poets and scholars said that attraction to other men can be natural but should be resisted in the name of piety and adherence to the laws of God. This includes Ibn Hazm, an Andalusian polymath who wrote about men who fell in love with other men and died from heartbreak. He also noted how it was in Al-Andalus and how people were often tolerant of people with these tendencies. This tolerance is mentioned in contemporary Christian sources, which describe it as a sin of the lustful Arabs. However, many show no accounts of its literal physicality, but rather the poetic aspects that were adopted from the Greeks. While male homosexuality seems to have been common to modern readers hoping to reconcile liberal ideas with Islam, there are fewer references to homosexuality than one might hope. Europeans visiting the Islamic world in the late medieval and early modern periods imagined a lot of homosexual activity, but there's little mention of it in Islamic sources. One amusing example is from a Venetian envoy at the Ottoman court of Suleiman the Magnificent, who wrote that if women in the harem wanted cucumbers, they were sent sliced to prevent their use for pleasure. This is likely fantasy, as there's no way the envoy would know what went on in the harem. We do have one example from Abbasid Caliph al-Hadi's era. He beheaded 2 women in his harem for engaging in a lesbian affair. There are mentions of female homosexuality outside the harem. Some female poets wrote about female lovers similarly to how male poets wrote about male lovers. We only know of these poetesses because they were mentioned in passing, and their poetry hasn't survived. Muhammad al-Idrisi noted that intelligent women often took female lovers to avoid submitting to men's wishes. Ottoman hammams, or bathhouses, became popular places for women to meet their female lovers. Muslims even took the matter to the Sultan, who appointed guards to some bathhouses, though this was likely ineffective since the guards were men. So, how did homosexuality exist in a society where it was forbidden? Various ideas suggest how early Muslims reacted to homosexuality. One idea is that homosexuality was already prevalent in some conquered areas, like Iran, especially pederasty in Persia. Additionally, Muslims studying Greek philosophy, which included homoerotic themes, helped normalize these ideas. This is supported by the fact that pre-Islamic Arabic poetry often used metaphors involving female lovers, but gradually shifted towards male lover metaphors due to Greek influence. When discussing homosexuality in the medieval Islamic world, there's a significant emphasis on passive and active roles during intercourse, similar to ancient Greece. But there still aren't references to it being normalized or common, hence, in the rare occasions of it being confessed, the people who acted on their feelings did get punished. There is another point that is interesting, which we can see in the modern Muslim world. The impact of gender-based segregation in the Islamic world has an impact on the development of homosexual tendencies. While homosexuality was not very common, nor was premarital heterosexual intercourse, or zina, but tendencies shown in poems showcase can urge. Some have noted that homosexual tendencies entered the Islamic world from Khorasan during the Abbasid Revolution when Abu Muslim forbade his men from contacting women. This is very similar to what we've seen in Saudi Arabia, where people often verbalize their affinity to men. But homosexuality still is condemned and deemed a sin in Islam regardless. Any confessions resulted in punishment, and those who confessed often wanted to purify themselves by being punished. Early history shows examples of people being punished for homosexuality. The Islamic world may have developed what Stephen Murray calls the will not to know, making those with homosexual tendencies more secretive, since it can't be openly discussed. Many believe the Ottoman Empire decriminalized homosexual acts in 1858, but this isn't accurate. Suleiman the Magnificent's law code criminalized it, but the punishment was usually a fine. This contrasts with Europe at the time, where the punishment was death. This leniency might have contributed to the decay of the Ottoman Empire, since it wasn't the only reformations they've done by the end of the empire. So, in practice, sodomy in private does not hold one to any accountability in this life. Their judgment is in the hereafter. The 1858 Penal Code didn't mention homosexual acts in private, only public indecency. This led to the misconception that it decriminalized homosexuality, which it didn't. So, what changed? Today, the Islamic world isn't considered friendly to homosexuality, although it is still more lenient than many others. Although it still exists, it's not as open as European nations. Poets no longer discuss their male lovers in their poems. Modern editions of medieval poems and stories with homoerotic themes, like Abu Nuwah's poetry and the Arabian Nights, are heavily criticized and censored. In the second half of the 19th century, much of the Islamic world was under foreign rule. Muslim scholars believe this was due to straying from God's path, leading to his disfavor. This is very true. Reformist and revivalist movements, like the Deobandi movement in India and the Salafi or Wahhabi movement in Arabia, gained influence and pushed for a countermeasure for Western values. When it comes to homosexuality, the rules still apply today as it were 1,000 years before. One with affinity to the same sex is not punished for their feelings, and the only way to be punished is to publicize and confess homosexual acts, since there is almost no way to be discovered if one is private. Witnesses can only be 4 practicing male Muslims. It is insanely impossible to ever be punished unless one wants to, and that is under a Sharia law. In secular states, as is the case in most of the Muslim world today, it varies, since they are not adhering to Muslim laws. These values are in line with Judaic and Christian values, whose roots are all Abrahamic, and they all condemn homosexuality and view it as a sin, although even these religions have reformists who are trying to reconcile liberalism with their traditions. However, the difference between Islam and the rest is that there is no criteria for judgment or punishments, as is the case with Islam. Islam makes it very hard for someone who is private to be persecuted for doing anything, not only acts of sodomy. These strict criteria make it hard to persecute anyone. However, as is the case with every faith, not many adhere to its principles and rules. Homosexual acts are still viewed as a sin no matter how much some may try to reform the religion, but, for those who have this affinity, it does not take them out of the fold of Islam if they are Muslim. After all, these feelings are between one person and the most merciful, and as long as they are not acting upon their feelings, they are not sinning. Also, even in the case that they do act upon their feelings, they still have room for repentance. In Islam, as long as you are private with your sin, and you are deeply regretful, there is always room for forgiveness between one and his God. The only gravest sin that is not forgivable is to deny God or falsely call for other gods other than Him. That is the worst of all, and even then, if one comes to realizing God, and are sincere, they are forgiven. So being a Muslim, or wanting to be a Muslim, and being fearful for being persecuted, is just unfounded. Throughout history, being punished was only possible through confessions or by blatantly being public about it. Let us know what you think in the comments. If you like this video, we urge you to give us a thumbs up as it helps us in creating more content. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon to see more great content. Thank you for watching.